Hello, Tech Sanders with the LightZone project, and the hills are alive with the sound of music. I'm sorry, I don't know what got into me. Actually, this video is about sharpening in LightZone. So let's immediately get to it. The green triangle is the sharpening tool. I've already deployed some tools in this image, and I'll pull out the sharpening tool and show you. It comes out modestly set, an amount of 100, a radius of 1, a threshold of 20. And already those of you who are familiar with editing software will see that this is your standard USM sharpener, unsharp mask sharpener. Well, sort of standard. We'll get to that in a moment. In LightZone, sharpening is done with the USM sharpener just as it is with other programs. I'm not going to get into what amount, radius, and threshold all do in a sharpener. There's so many videos online about sharpening, it's ridiculous. So I urge you to read a whole bunch of that stuff. They go back all the way to the early days of digital photography and continue to this day. I am going to say that this doesn't really differ much from any other USM sharpening tool, except this one has a tool settings tab and a color selection tab. I encourage you to go back and look at the tool anatomy videos and pay particular attention to the tool settings tab and the color selection tab. As we've also made videos on the zone mapper and the relight tool, I've talked about these tool settings and color selection tabs. As we work on videos for the other tools, I'll continue talking about them. They're particularly pertinent for the sharpening tool. I'm going to disable the sharpening tool, however, and talk about something that's more philosophically oriented in LightZone. Those of you who've been watching the videos and reading about the program ought to understand by now that one of the key features of LightZone is tonality control, contrast control. And sharpening is nothing more than local contrast enhancement. So I want you to look at this image here. I want you to see this tool stack. The raw tone curve, we already have talked about. The raw adjustments tool, I've done nothing but shoot the color noise slider up. The relight tool, I have made some adjustments to. I've got a zone mapper tool. I've made some adjustments to that. I've got a hue saturation tool, selected blue, and I've got a hue saturation tool, selected yellow. Let's look at the original image. Well, that's fairly bland, and it's not that sharp. When I bring up what I have done, and remember, our sharpening tool has been disabled, I think you ought to see that the changes that I have made with these four tools, even before I get to the sharpening tool, have made a great deal of difference in this image in terms of its appearance of sharpness. There's the original, and there's what I've done. And basically everything I've done has been some kind of contrast enhancement. I also direct you to Doug Pardee's excellent little piece on the lightzoneproject.org website in the forums about the blend modes and about contrast. He also has a piece about sharpening. Doug is very wise about many of these things, and I encourage you to read those very carefully. But in his blend modes piece, he comments on the fact that really all we're talking about are these contrast adjustments. So again, without the sharpener being included in this tool stack mix, because it's disabled, you can see that the image is a great deal sharper than it was previously. And that goes right down to these hue saturation tools. Let's take a look at the relight tool first. I'm going to disable it. And I think you can see that tool itself did a lot towards creating an atmosphere of sharpness, for lack of a better term for it. And also, if you look at the relight tool videos, you'll note that, in fact, the relight tool has 3 sliders in it that effectively do sharpening. The detail slider, the depth slider, and the fuzz slider. So already in this image, before I even went to a USM sharpening tool, I've already started sharpening the image using these sliders. With the Zone Mapper tool, I have once again increased my contrast. I'll disable that. I think you'll see that the addition of the Zone Mapper tool also does a great deal to give us the effect of sharpness in the image, even though this is not a sharpener. The hue saturation tool, the first one, I selected the blue out of the original blue sky, and I enhanced its saturation and vibrance. And the effect of doing that has also created some subtle sharpening effects, if you will, in these slopes of these mountains here. Watch what happens when I disable that tool. The effect is subtle, but it is definitely there. I disable it, and there's just a little bit of feeling of it flattening out a little bit. When I enable the tool, there's just a little bit more punch, not just in the sky, but also in these slopes, which of course green has blue in it, and there's going to be some atmospheric haze back here that's going to be enhanced, if you will, by increasing the blue saturation. Similarly, if we go to the hue saturation tool, I've selected yellow, the yellow of these balsam root flowers. Watch what happens when I deselect the hue saturation tool. I'll disable it. Okay, so they're still very yellow, but look carefully when I select that tool again and enable it, particularly right here. Look at this flower right here. I'm going to enable it. And by popping up the yellow, the center portion is a little bit darkened, and I'm getting some more intensity in the yellow, and it's popping up a little bit more of the orange part of the flower, and that in itself is a contrast change. And so now they're popping out more. Again, we're getting an overall feeling of more sharpness as we move along. And that's before I've even touched this sharpening tool. Remember, it's been disabled this whole time. When I enable it with these settings, you don't see much happening. Now, if I increase my sharpening, I have to increase it a long way before you see anything. I'm going to roll it back a little bit. Now I'll increase my radius. And once again, there I start to see something. At this point in time, of course, you have to decide what kind of output you're talking about. If you're outputting for print, you know that you need to over sharpen a little bit in terms of what it looks like on your monitor. If it's primary viewing is on a monitor, then you want to roll that sharpness back. You also want to determine whether your details are very fine, in which case you want a lower radius, maybe, or whether they're more kind of larger, grosser changes, in which case you want a higher radius. You also want to think about where you want to place your threshold in terms of the light-dark changes that are happening, etc. Furthermore, you have your camera sensor, the size of your camera sensor, and how many megapixels you've got to consider in all of this as well. So there's a lot to consider. Again, I refer you back to the internet to check on general ideas about sharpening. But the last thing I'll leave you with is you can use the Tool Settings tab, pick a blend mode, and perhaps increase the sharpening effects using a blend mode. Okay, something like that maybe. You can adjust it with the tool opacity slider. So this gives your sharpening tool a lot more flexibility than your normal USM sharpening tool. You can also select the color selection tab, and you can pick particular colors in the, or ranges of colors in the image that you want to sharpen at the expense of other sharpening. You can also, of course, because you can see it here, I've used two hue saturation tools. You can do multi-pass sharpening by simply adding more sharpening tools. And by selecting different parts of the image that you want to sharpen, you can do that multi-pass sharpening effectively and very easily in LightZone. You can do shadows, mids and highlights, midtones, etc. So even though LightZone Sharpening Tool looks dull in comparison with a lot of the fancy things that you see in other programs and plugins that are made specifically for sharpening, actually in LightZone, sharpening is pretty sophisticated, and you have a lot of different places where it can happen and how you can make it happen. Remember also that it's easy to, for instance, select a portion. There's the sky I've selected. I can invert this. Now, when I sharpen, I'm going to sharpen everything but that color. So that's a way to keep your sky from getting sharpened, or any other color that you want to avoid having sharpened by your sharpening tool. So again, lots of flexibility within the tool itself, deceptively so, but also remember that because of the way LightZone works and the levels that you can build up in a tool stack, sharpening is actually something that you do all through the process because of how you're adjusting contrast in LightZone.